Hello, I'm Bob Mover, and I'd like to welcome you to On the Real Side. Today, I'm very honored and very happy to have a wonderful piano player and a great guy as our guest, a piano player that I and I believe many other people feel should be, like a lot of people we talk to here, uh, better known uh, for his gifts. You know, if his recognition matched the scope of his talents, uh, that's the way it should be. But we do deal with the world as it is, and I'm very happy that Michael has, still been able to play music all over the world and has had quite an illustrious career and continues to have it. So I'd like to greet and say hello to my friend Michael Weiss.
Hey, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Oh man, real pleasure. You've always been one of my favorite, cats. And you know, even though you're less than a household word, I happened to do some looking up of you because a lot of the time the cats people I talk to here, we know each other more on the bandstand than we know each other in
Off the bandstand.
off the bandstand. Like I mean, the typical conversation when you're playing a gig between sets isn't, "Oh, did you have siblings?" You know what I mean? Unless or what'd your dad do? These kind of things, or how did you get interested in music? How did you get interested in jazz? So we try to cover those questions here. And I knew Michael had worked with quite a lot of people, but this list, my gosh, I met Mike when he was playing. We met, I believe, for the first time when you were playing with Johnny Griffin, and I think you were up in Toronto, and I was living in Toronto at that time.
And we came over to your house for lunch.
You came over to my house, and I made just Italian food, I think, for lunch.
Right.
And you and Dennis Irwin and Kenny Washington, I think you guys all.
Right.
Griff didn't make it that day, but you guys came over, and it was great. We had fun, and then we had played. The last time I remember, well, we played a little bit at the bar on 11th Street about a year ago. We both sat in, I think, with Grant Stewart and Joe Magnarelli there
Hmm.
one night. Before then, I remember a gig we played at this little club between the Zinc Bar and Arturo's. It was called Madam X, I think.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
and they had a piano.
Right.
Yeah,
On
and
Houston.
on Houston. Yeah, and you know what? It was funny because the other night I saw a Law and Order or Blue Bloods. One of those shows was on, and they have a meeting, and goes to meet someone, and he goes, and there's the club, Madam X. They're in there, and I said, oh yeah, last time I was in there, I was playing with Michael Weiss, and we played some beautiful duets, and
That's right. It was a duo gig. That's right.
yeah, and we played to about 7 people who all enjoyed it very much, um, and that was actually our last actual gig together, and but the people that Mike has played with, besides Griffin, there's Art Farmer, Benny Golson, Slide Hampton, Frank West, the Heath brothers, Jimmy Heath, George Coleman, Charles McPherson, John Hendricks, Lou Donaldson, Junior Cook, Bill Hardman, Vanguard Jazz Orchestra, the Mingus Epitaph Orchestra, Joe Henderson, Woody Shaw, Clifford Jordan. It's like somebody just took a book of the history of jazz in our times and just opened it, and there's Michael Weiss, a virtual Zelig of
And
jazz.
Pepper Adams.
And Pepper Adams, yes, well, I should go through the rest of the list.
That's all right.
Pepper Adams, Gary Bartz, Joe Lovano, Ron Carter, David Fathead Newman, Nancy Wilson, Randy Brecker, Tom Harrell, Jerry Mulligan, Wynton Marsalis, and numerous others. He also has been on some television appearances, PBS Live from Lincoln Center, Night Watch, and a show with Wynton Marsalis. I didn't realize you'd done so much with him. And you were the second prize winner in the 1989 Thelonious Monk Institute International Piano Competition, which, competitions are strange, but who was the first prize? Do you remember?
Bill Cunliffe.
Bill Cunliffe. Okay, nice piano player too. But yeah, so as what that means is that Mike's been around. Michael has been around. So, you're originally from Dallas, Texas. Is that true?
Yes.
So, there was a famous art school there. The wasn't there a famous high school? Magnet.
Yeah, but
Art,
right, but that school separated into its own the year after I graduated high school. Prior to that, where I went to school, all of the magnet specialties were all under one roof at a school called Skyline. And I also had 4 hours of music a day. But the year after I graduated high school, they got their own school, the arts magnet.
because there were, I think Roy Hargrove came out of there, and
Right.
there were a few people I think that were of note who had
Mm-hmm.
come out of that school. And so your family, let's start with that. Did you have a musical family, and how did you start to play the piano?
Not particularly, although I owe me starting piano lessons to my mother, who was a exceptional amateur visual artist, but her artistic temperament is probably what was responsible for me starting piano lessons at age 6.
Uh-huh. And what kind of visual art did
She
filming?
she painted, she did oil, watercolor, batik, sculpture. She did a lot of different kind of stuff.
So the creative part
Screen.
was there. And what was your dad into?
He was in the fashion industry. He had his own line of women's apparel.
I see.
So that was his area.
And were they? Did you grow up in a two-parent home
Yes.
and siblings?
I have a sister who is also a very gifted visual artist. She went in various different directions, but Dallas wasn't a big hotbed of jazz at the time that I was coming up, but I did manage to hear Red Garland one time at a club in South Dallas called the Arandis.
I was going to ask you about that because the only time yes, I knew that Red Garland had gone back to.
Yeah, he was in Dallas, but I was influenced and interested in a lot of different kinds of jazz and music at that time, and one Dallas jazz veteran that I did play with occasionally was a tenor player named Marshall Ivory, who was really great. Art Blakey took an interest in him and had him join his band briefly in the early 80s, and he's kind of Fathead's generation, and James Clay, they all kind of came up around the same time in Dallas.
And James Clay wasn't around at that time too much.
He might have been, but I didn't have any awareness of it,
So when you came from a very, I see where the artistic part comes from there. It was a very encouraging, creative, encouraging. There were also some saxophone players, but I never know if it was Dallas or Houston. But Jimmy Ford was a saxophone player I used to hear about.
Right.
Heard him on records with Maynard's band. He was a very unique alto player.
Right.
I guess Arnett Cobb was down there. I mean, from what I know of Texas, that was
Arnett Cobb is Houston.
Houston, right? So that's where that was, and Texas is so big that that's like coming from a different country.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so you remember what was first of all, the first music that you remember being attracted to? You remember what?
Uh, yeah, that would have been the Beatles when I was 6 years old, 5, 6 years old. The Beatles and all the pop music of the day. You know, I heard all those records and got those records probably mainly through my older sister. Uh, but you know, anything that was on that was popular at that time, I was aware of. And even though I began classical piano lessons, I gravitated to the piano to pick things out by ear. And I think I figured out that I had perfect pitch, or I had very good relative pitch, and could pick things out pretty quickly. And by 13 years old, I think I had a Farfisa organ, and I had my little garage bands, rock bands, and stuff like that. So um, those were the first. That was the first music that I was aware of, and then you know the pop and rock music of the 60s and early 70s.
Or
You know,
when did it
was up
happen
on
then?
that.
You know, do you had a jazz awakening at some point? A lot of jazz musicians I know had a certain Zen moment, you know,
Well, my piano teacher suggested that I go to the Interlochen music camp, and when I went there for a summer camp when I was 15 years old, which was 1973, and that was my first exposure to jazz. They sent a little checklist of courses, kind of like a college curriculum, like you sign up for your classes, and there were things to participate in, such as jazz improvisation and jazz arranging. It's like, what? I don't know what that is, but that sounds interesting. Let's check that out. The my first exposure to jazz was when the faculty jazz quintet played a tune, a relatively recent tune from a Freddie Hubbard CTI record called Mr. Clean.
we used to play that
And
with Chet Baker.
right, and that blew me away. And that same summer, Duke Ellington came performed with his band, and the Stan Kenton band also came to the school. And
Where
with
is Interlochen, just so people would know? Where was
in
it located?
northern Michigan, near Traverse City, Michigan, and uh, Peter Erskine was a product of that program, and he had just joined Kenton's band. He was probably, 4 or 5 years ahead of me, and the jazz teacher there was a trombonist named David Sporney, who really I owe so much to, because within 6-8 weeks I had written a big band arrangement.
Wow.
After not, I mean, very elementary, and certainly not particularly sophisticated, but I was exposed to. I learned everything about jazz harmony and 4 and 5 part harmony, and passing diminished chords, and seventh chords, and all. And I just soaked it up like a sponge, because it was like the most fertile time for me, musically, mentally, to absorb this new language. I was really ready for it. And then when I started high school, I had 4 hours of music a day. The big band rehearsed every day for an hour, and anything I wrote for the band I could get played. So that
Oh,
was a great opportunity. We played a lot of Thad Jones, and so that blew my mind. That exposed me to Thad's style of writing. And but at the same time, uh, Return to Forever, Weather Report, Headhunters, Mahavishnu Orchestra, all of that was in its heyday. So I was very interested and influenced by that music. I was also beginning to listen to Miles and Coltrane. But when I started high school, my big band teacher, the jazz teacher there, he said, I want you to get this record by Horace Silver. It's called Blowing the Blues Away. And I want you to listen to this song called Sister Sadie. And I want to see if you can write out, transcribe, notate the melody of that song. It was my first first jazz record I bought, I ordered it. I had to wait a few weeks for it to arrive at the record store. And
You were listening to this other music already.
no, kind
Oh,
of all beginning around the same time. I don't know what happened first. Uh, and so I did what I was told, and that record, the first records you buy, it's like shapes you forever. That's your fundamental influence. You can't get, it's hard to get around that, no
yeah, I
matter how
know.
much stuff, whatever you listen to after that, your roots are your roots.
I know. I bought
So
the Miles Davis Roundabout Midnight record with the group with Red Garland
yeah,
and Chapman and
and I'm sure to this day you can sing every solo on the whole record.
every
And
note.
I can sing every solo on that Horace Silver record. And as fate would have it, I spent years playing with Junior Cook, and I played with a lot of Horace Silver alumni, and I got to know Horace. And I played with Louis Hayes, I played with Gene Taylor, I played with Junior. Sadly, I never got to hear Blue Mitchell, but I ended up, all these things kind of. It's interesting how things come around.
It's
How
very
seeds are
interesting.
planted and plants come up out of the ground.
My other first record that I got about within days or weeks of each other, was this Dizzy Gillespie record called Something Old, Something New, which had the quintet with Kenny Barron, Moody, and Rudolph Collins on drums,
And
and
Chris White.
Chris White, right. And the funny thing was, when I was 13 years old, my mother took us one night to the Vanguard, not the Vanguard, I'm sorry, to the Village Gate, and we heard two bands. And one band was this Dizzy Gillespie band, who I had just bought the record of, and I could sing every solo on both sides of that record. And the other band was Mingus's group, with Jaki Byard and Charles McPherson and Lonnie Hillier and Danny Richmond. And those were the two bands on that night at the gate. My mother actually dressed my brother up in a little. We all wore black turtlenecks, and she painted a little mustache on him. And we all went down to the village. This was our exciting. We were visiting New York from Florida, and you had to have a village experience. So she said, "Let's go and hear these bands." My mother it was hip to jazz. But what was really strange was I had just turned 13 at that time, and by the time I was 20, when I was 16, I was actually sitting in with Major Holly, and Kenny Barron was on piano, and I was actually, on the bandstand with them. And then when I was 19, I was with Mingus for the first time and playing with. So those two bands I heard on that night, I hadn't even started to play the saxophone yet. And and that's why life is so interesting that
But
way.
those aren't accidents.
Right, that's the beauty of it, right?
I mean,
That
there, I believe in the randomness of nature and fate and all that, but a lot of the things that end up happening to you, you may not be 100% responsible for, but you are to a certain. You put yourself in a situation where the potential for things like that to happen can happen.
Yeah, that's something that's fascinated me all through life. I mean, that's, I guess, when people talk about, the nature of life, the nature of what are there divine spirits, are there, what's guiding us through life, and I guess personal religion, in a sense, not in sense of formal organized religion, but one's personal viewpoint, spiritual outlook at the world. So like stories like what you're talking about and what we just are discussing are they're so profoundly true, aren't they? You know, and Griffin used to. I mean, I knew him too. And Griffin would sometimes talk about how some of us, we're not all Earthlings. How you remember he would go, "Those damn Earthlings." I remember him saying that once, "Damn Earthlings! How stupid can people be?" We were just discussing some kind of thing, and he said, see, that's an example of Earthling thinking, or something like, and he said, we're not from here, which is something my mother told me too, by the way, that was, but that certain people that hook up to these divine experiences they're even related to something, which we won't have to get into that.
That's probably as close as Griffin ever got to Sun Ra's way of thinking.
Yeah. Sun Ra was the extreme of that, I would say. Yeah. But so go ahead. So then, you had these, uh, yeah, you got to meet later. I mean, there was your Blowing the Blues Away record. And later on, you played with Junior. And, I mean, I knew Junior well, too. We used to carry each other home from after-hour sessions.
Right, right.
What?
Yeah, well, what the thing is in the early 70s, there was so much great music. I mean, jazz was so much creative things going on, and importantly too is that popular music, I think, was in some way, well, maybe with the exception of the great American songbook songwriters to a certain extent, popular music of that day was at least from let's say with a rock beat, was never more sophisticated. I mean, Stevie Wonder and Tower of Power and Steely Dan and Earth, Wind and Fire and even popular Burt Bacharach, those songs, popular, the sophisticated, I mean, Stevie Wonder in particular, the sophistication, the harmonic sophistication of that music is on such a high level, and it got over on the people. People didn't even realize how hip that music was. He had the gift of making the most sophisticated melodies and harmony totally accessible.
Yeah, I mean, he was no Stevie Wonder, but even Billy Joel's music, on a very commercial level, but it still had chord changes. Right. There was still, harmonies going on. And, there was a tune like my kids, I've got my, 3 daughters. One is older, and I have a 17-year-old and a 10-year-old. And I sometimes play them. I say, well, this is some of the music that was popular for kids your age when I was, a little older than that. But like that song Reminiscing by the Little River Band, that one was very nice, and it's got a beautiful, little wonderful set of changes to it. And, it's, last night it was late. I was walking home. We got down through the gate, and I was dreaming of the night. It was on every jukebox at that time. Would it turn out right, But there's like, wow. And Stevie was very responsible for what happened to everybody, man. What happened all of a sudden? How did it go from that, from things like Creepin' and
right.
Stevie was coming up with, Ain't No Use and those kind of things. That was very exciting music, no matter what you played. Tom Harrell and I used to sit around listening to that stuff together. We would just be
trying to figuring out
what he was doing. How did he do this? And like, we'd study that till we'd study Duke Ellington. And then the next thing you knew, I mean, was it rap that did it to everything? Or is it all of a sudden, it's like music is melody, harmony, rhythm, and meter. And then
it's none of those things.
Bye-bye melody. And it was bye-bye harmony. And then it was like bye-bye any kind of spontaneous rhythm, because there's these drum machines generating, the heartbeat is out of the music. The fact that it isn't metronomic, that music is, but all of a sudden there it was. And now here we are, in really the lowest point that pop music, I think, has probably ever been at.
Yeah. Well, we keep doing what we do.
We do. And it's interesting, though, that, you came up listening to Chick and Weather Report and John McLaughlin and these things, which are,
but also Horace Silver and Miles and Thad Jones and whatever records I was collecting. I remember I really loved Elvin Blue Note Records without piano.
Yeah, with Frank Foster and Richard Davis and those
Frank Foster
Carol and
and Joe.
Jimmy.
This record called Genesis. I had that in high school. I love that record. Tons of reverb, like 3 tenors, bass, and drums. I love that. And I had this record, a CTI record of Joe Farrell called Moon Germs. That
Yeah.
to this day I think is just unbelievably great record.
Did you get to know Joe at all?
No, I never did. I met him once briefly in Bradley's, but didn't talk to him.
Yeah, he was not the friendliest person, but he actually, there was a warm and fuzzy side to him once you got there. I was fortunate to become his friend. But funny guy, he was Joe Ferrantello. When he used
Right.
to come hear us with Chet Baker, we used to play at Strikers, and he was around the corner. He didn't live far from there, so he would come in, and he would ask me to put his drinks on my tab, and he'd pay me at the end of the night. That's what he was doing. So I'm sitting there, and I said to Joe, and we had both been proteges of Ira Sullivan, Joe in Chicago and me in Miami. So we had that kinship, almost like having a common uncle,
Right, right.
And so, and we did one little non-jazz date called the Players Association, where we played tunes like Love Hangover. The idea was to play jazz musicians playing over pop tunes of the day. And so we did that. We did John Faddis, Joe and I were the front line. And I did it too, For the Love of You, the Isley Brothers. And that's another very nice pop tune of that era. I played it on soprano, and I was surprised that it was nice material, some of it. But anyway, Joe, I'd say to Joe, in fact, I squeaked on that record a couple of times, and Joe says, it's all right, bird chirped. And and he started to call me Chirp. And he'd say, you're a chirp off the old bird. And, but I say, so Joe, what does your wife do? I knew he had a family and stuff. What do you mean, what does my wife do? She's my old lady. That's what she does. He was like, what kind of question is that? But yeah, he's another one, that it's funny how some people, just the marketing of jazz in general, and others like you and even me and me too. There's a certain group of people that get included into a cadre of the people that will be taught in schools, that will be famous, quote, that will get a certain type of recognition. And, Joe, even though he was commercially successful, probably, as much or more than most people of his generation, now, years later, after Joe has been gone for 20 years, people don't really know Joe unless you happen to chance upon these Elvin Jones records.
Well, he's probably best known for being a member of Return to Forever than anything else, I would think.
Yeah, probably. That would be what it was. But it's interesting that you came around to really playing more mainstream. I haven't heard you play, and even a lot of these people that are mentioned here, you weren't really so active in the fusion type of.
That's kind of come later. I kind of had a turnaround much later in my career as far as putting certain elements of my roots together in different ways, where I could incorporate that style of music composition. It's really in the composition where classical influences and rock background and jazz and all the jazz vocabulary and language can all come together in a less categorizable format.
Because, well, are there any examples of that are out on, available for people to hear? Is it?
Well, there's only one track that's actually been released. Well, there's some stuff on YouTube. There's some live recordings where some of that music is is out. There's a record I did of all original compositions for sextet called Soul Journey, and the title track I play Rhodes on, and it's that record is very composition heavy, and but I started to really write in that kind of way in earnest after that recording, and I haven't had anything released yet that has those compositions on it.
When was this recording?
Soul Journey, that was in 2000. But a few years later, I led a group at the Vanguard, and I had a number of a bulk of the compositions that I was performing there was some of it had a lot more, let's say, straight eighth kinds of rhythms, rock for lack of a better word, and let's say the pieces would average like 60-70% composition, 30% improvisation, rather than the other way around.
I see. And I was wondering, and so with that year, was that all when you were leading the band at the Vanguard and everything? What year was that, or what?
2006.
2006.
And 7 and 8.
Ah, so, and the thing was though that you didn't have, as far as I know, and I'm kind of out of it too, business wise. I don't always know what's going on. Did you have any kind of major label or even minor label record contract support behind you?
No.
And you got the gig at the Vanguard based on
well, I played there
with Griff, I know.
a few hundred times by that point. You know, it didn't just come out of nowhere. I'd played there many years since 87 or 88 with Johnny Griffin. I played there with Charles McPherson. I played there with Slide Hampton. I played there with Von Freeman. Played there with Charles McPherson. I played there, years with the Vanguard big band, and then recently to that time, I organized a couple of weeks there with Joe Wilder, and I think that's when Lorraine asked me to bring in my own group.
I see, because if Lorraine liked you, that was good. She wasn't so adhering to the record companies and the pressures that were put on a lot of club owners to have somebody who's got a record being played on the radio.
Right. So I mean, all these various, hills in my career that would have normally been or should have been stepping stones, as far as like a label, with the label or a certain kind of recognition, just for whatever reason, just didn't happen. But as far as name recognition, I think that's you touched on something. It's like signing to a major label or some label that signs you to a multi-recording deal where there's some publicity machine working on your behalf is essential. It's very hard to I mean, nowadays I don't know how things work now with social media and the internet and so forth, as far as that side of the business. That's not the time that I really came up with, so.
It was very essential. That's because I got a phone call from a disc jockey in Nanaimo, a very nice guy, BC, and he said, "How come you're not known as as well as you should be?" And I said, "Well, I'm not alone. There's a bunch of people, and you were one of the people I would mention." That I said, "It's very simple. There's really a one sentence answer. We were never signed by major record companies, or we never got multi-record deals. And because of that, you just didn't get known. You were either chosen or you weren't. You know, Paul Bley explained it to me once in terms of he said there's so many slots, Bobby. He said there's a certain amount of slots. There's a slot for, say, 5 piano players, you know, maybe 10 piano players. He said, you know, and so you have a slot. Out of that, you've got maybe 3 white piano players. You've got 1 young piano player, 2 young piano players, 1 older piano player. And he went down, I don't remember exactly how he described it.
He figured out a formula, huh?
But he said there's a formula in the way recognition and success based on recognition works. And if you don't fit in, somebody else has your slot. You know, because it was funny because Zoot was very ill. And I was talking to Paul, we were at a festival with Zoot. And I mean, you know, we had a lot of different bands and stuff, but I knew Zoot was on the way out. And I told Paul that it was upsetting to me because I had been close friends with Zoot Sims we're talking about. And Paul says, well, you know, it's sad. It's always sad, but there is an upside to it. I said, what upside could there be? He said, well, you know, there aren't that many people playing the genre that you're playing. And when Zoot goes, then there's one slot has open. I said, that's kind of cold, but true.
Yeah.
In a weird way, you know, so, so I mean, I think what we're talking about here is just that, you know, there were certain slots for your generation. Brad Meldau comes to mind, you know, and then a couple of other people.
He's really of an earlier generation. He's a younger generation. I mean, later generation.
Later generation than you. You know, I guess you're Benny Green and you were the same generation.
No, Benny's younger than me.
Benny's younger than you too.
No, my peers are David Hazeltine, Michael Adon. He's maybe a year older than me. Mulgrew was a couple of years older. But I guess you could, I mean, Benny came along around pretty much the same time, early 80s.
Well, I mean, all of these cats are deserving, but it's funny, you mentioned Michael Adon and Hazeltine and you, and of the 3 of you, none of you have really gotten the, you know, the acclaim, you know, that you could have gotten. I guess because a lot of the time I know you guys as sidemen with great people, but your stuff on your own, it's not so easy to find. And I just think that it's a shame that the record companies didn't go with that. Now I think it has much more to do with how much money you have to finance your own career. I mean, I've seen a couple of examples out there, which is basically somebody who has some bread and they've managed to put themselves in a very good situation with it without a major record company or anything like that. They're their own producer, and I've seen that kind of success, which it seems to happen more in this day and age because there's more what they call vanity productions in a way.
Yeah, well, that's why, you know, I mean, being signed to a label, my first record as a leader was for Crisscross, which was an established label. I mean, I was my record was number 28, I think. But in 1986, there was still very few, hardly anyone was self-producing and starting their own labels and something like that. And to be recorded by and financed by a label that had great artists on their roster was like very exciting. Recording at Rudy's and everything.
Yeah, so but still, you know, Terry Deacon's Crisscross. I mean, he's a wonderful guy, and his heart, he loved the music so much. I used to know him when he was selling the record. He had a little stand where he sold records
at the festival,
NOS festival and stuff in Eervaart in Amsterdam. When I was with Chet Baker, I met him, and he asked me to record for him. And being an idiot, I said, well, you know, he said, nobody's going to hear it. It's a small record company. You know, I don't know. I said, yeah, we'll do it. And I never did it. And then he didn't offer any advance really or anything.
No.
You know, so And Chet said, of course, Chet said, "No, hold out." He said, "You can do better." And one more brilliant advice from the great from Chet.
Oh,
Um,
Chet made records for him.
he did, yes, he finally did, and but I mean, that was the smaller label, and the people that were, the Bob Blacks and the Mark Feldmans and those people, Reservoir, there were a bunch of people that loved the music, but if you went on tour, you weren't going to get to bring a band on tour because they're not going to pay for your hotel on the day off. Where a larger record company could do that for you.
Right.
And also just the fact of just advertising, that's what I mean. I felt like, well, and it wasn't a very wise idea. Oh, Jerry, he won't advertise. Nobody will ever know it. It'll be like, and it wasn't a good decision on my part. But the thing is that I learned it's always good to make the record.
Yeah. If you're not appearing, you're disappearing.
That's right. Art Blakey, I believe, was one of his famous statements, right?
Right.
And, so, I mean, some other things I was thinking about was um, there's a few things. I was thinking of all the cats you worked with. There's so many experiences um, that I'm sure are very memorable.
Yes.
But also, just on a lighter note, a lot of funny things happen when you're in these situations, and a lot of the generation of what we might call the great generation, the cats that we were the tail end of, that we got to play with. You could stay up for days just telling funny things, humorous things that happen. Anything particularly come to your mind? Any kind of like, particularly humorous?
I have to say, like right in the spur of the moment, I'm kind of drawing a blank.
Right,
But,
it's hard
but
to do.
maybe we'll circle back to, or something will spawn a memory of a certain experience. But I will say that everybody I had the great fortune of working with did have a great sense of humor, different kinds of sense of humor, but definitely humor is a fundamental component, I think, of jazz, of
Yeah,
this music. As serious as it can be, I think you got to have a touch of humor in what you express.
well, you experienced when you came to New York, it was 1982. Is that
Right.
right? About 1982.
Beginning of 82, yeah.
So that would be the last days of Bradley's.
No. Brad, I worked as a sideman and as a leader at Bradley's from 1988 through 92, 93.
No, but I mean when Bradley was alive.
Well, Bradley hired me just before he passed. That would have been around 88,
Right, 88. That's
89,
right.
88, 89, something like that.
Yeah. So
My
I
first
applaud.
week at my first week at Bradley's was with George Coleman and Bob Cranshaw,
Oh,
six
that's,
nights. Uh,
um,
and then also a couple of Sunday nights with Ted Curson and different people. But then I was able to have my own groups there.
but they already had horns there because they weren't allowed because of the cabaret law.
Well, they started having horns, but they didn't have drums yet. But it's I think it's possible I might have been one of the first people to have drums for a week. Started having drums on Sundays, and then I began most of the time, almost all my leader gigs for a week's engagement were with drums. They're all trio gigs and some
Because,
quartet.
right, because back in, I guess it was the early 80s,
It was all duos then.
right, it was all duos. So about 84, 85, I think they started to have horns and drums. Because I remember we had a big meeting with Clifford Jordan and Pete LaRocca, who was Pete Sims, as a lawyer. Um, we all had this meeting down there to try to repeal the cabaret law, and it succeeded in the end. They managed to do that, but I mean, I was always sitting in. I mean, Kat sat in all the time at Bradley's, but you couldn't legally work there. You know, you couldn't be a leader with horns and all that.
Mm.
But I mean, I saw a lot of humor would go down at Bradley's, you know, and the amount of when Bradley would start to play the piano when this club would officially close, and then you'd just be sitting there, and it was like a paradise. Just all the, you know, Bradley would go, he'd sit down at the piano and start to play something like "For Heaven's Sake, Let's Fall in Love," and next thing you knew, Tommy Flanagan was up saying, "You know what I like to do there on that bridge? Don't say a word. I like this." And then Walter Bishop or Walter Davis or somebody would come up and say, "You know, I like this here." And next thing you knew, you had like a conference. I told people that was like my higher education, just hanging out and listening to these piano players discuss the chord changes. And, you know, there was a lot of interaction with, you know, I mean, on personal level too. Who were the first cats that, like, when you came to New York, did you have mentors, teachers? Like, who were the cats that kind of you got next to?
Well,
And what brought you to New York? That's another.
well, just because this is where I had to be.
Right. Yeah.
You know, for all the reasons that everybody comes to New York. You know, when I went to college in Indiana, and when I had breaks from school, spring breaks, summer, Christmas, I would go to New York and I would hang out in New York instead of going back home to Dallas. I would hang out in New York and club hop and sit in and hear as much music, as many of my heroes as I could. And I guess Junior was maybe the first that I ended up getting to play with. I was subbing for a friend when I was visiting New York at the Surf Maid.
I remember the Surf Maid.
And Junior came by. I was playing solo, and Junior just walked by and took out his horn and played with me, duo, and that was a thrill. And then I ended up, soon after moving to New York, I became a regular at the Star Cafe and was in Junior's quartet, and we played every week for 2 years or so, every Monday and other nights too. That's how I got to play with Woody Shaw, and Lou Donaldson heard me there and hired me from that. And a lot of musicians would come by, Cecil Taylor, Pharoah Saunders, Sonny Fortune, people like that would come by and hang out. So I'd say Junior was kind of my first sort of name player that I was playing with regularly, and then through that I joined his quintet with Bill Hardman. I would first be subbing for Mickey Tucker, and then I joined the band, and I was in the band, and we worked all around New York. We went to Europe for about a 2-month tour with Walter Booker and Leroy Williams, and that was a great opportunity. And then my early gigs, well, my first tour really was with John Hendricks. I joined in April, May of '82, and we did some very extensive touring in the States and Europe.
Oh.
And then I began working, did some gigs with Slide Hampton through Ray Appleton, who that was because I met him in Indiana.
Killer Ray.
Killer Ray. And then I used to play at a club called the Angry Squire. So I played quartet there with Junior, and then I had a gig, and I asked Pepper Adams would he make it with me, and he played with me one weekend. Clifford Jordan.
Yeah, I was living in Canada during that time, but I would come in. I heard Hank Mobley's very last gig
I was there.
was at the Angry Squire.
Yeah, I was there. In fact, I had a wonderful encounter with Hank at when the Blue Note label was resurrected in February of '85. They had a big concert with all the Blue Note All Stars at Town Hall, and I had been hired to transcribe a lot of arrangements from the original recordings that they played on the concert, like Mode for Joe and stuff like that. Uh, and after the concert was over, there was supposed to be some kind of little jam session in the green room at Town Hall. And when everything was over, I was hanging out there with Kenny Washington and Hank Mobley, who was, I believe, not even invited to participate. He came there from Philly on his own. He didn't have a horn and he spoke a little on the mic, but he was still there, and he had lost his overcoat and he didn't have any way to get back to Philly. So Kenny and I took him in a cab to Penn Station and got him train fare back to Philly. But before that, I was sitting at the piano and Hank was sitting right next to me, and I decided to play Deep in a Dream for him because he recorded that with Kenny Dorham, I think,
Mm-hmm.
and Sonny Clark. So I'm playing Deep in a Dream, and Hank is sitting there and he says, "Yeah, now come down that scale and go up to arpeggio." He's sort of like directing me. That's all I remember. I just
Wow.
remember that happened. But I at that time I knew a lot of Hank songs. I could have played any number of his tunes, but I was probably just so in awe, I just in the moment, But Hank's always been, one of my all-time favorites.
Yeah, he was a great guy. There was something very sad about him. Another one who just kind of like didn't, there was a slot. In fact, there's been a big slot for him since he's gone. He may have a posthumous slot bigger than a lot of people. But when he was
Yeah.
alive, he was like, there were people like, I knew him and I knew Kenny Dorham and Wynton Kelly when I was a teenager. And these guys, Wynton Kelly was playing at the Riverboat with Tyree Glenn and wondering how he could have gone from Miles to having his own trio to going to playing with Tyree Glenn, which was not his cup of tea really, but it was a steady gig. And KD was driving a taxi and working at Manny's Music, and Hank was like trying to survive basically, and the fourth member of their friendship group was Paul Chambers, who this was the summer of 1969, was on his way out. He had cancer and was dying. So I got to know these people then, and it was just, where is the world when these people, guys like this, are not being recognized?
It's amazing when you think of these giants who in many times in their career held non-music jobs. Even someone as prolific as like J.J. Johnson. I don't know if he had guys who worked in a factory or worked in the mailroom or did this and that.
I know Wes Montgomery did that for a while, but the thing is that what's weird about these guys, though, was it was after they'd already made some mark on music. It's like, okay, I understand why you're getting established. You worked in the mailroom or you did this or you did that. But once you're out there, like Whitten would say, he says, my career seems to be heading backwards. He said, the other guy, everybody else plays with Miles. They're getting all this recognition because he was talking about Herbie and Chick, who was just going on his own, and Keith Jarrett. He says, but Red Garland and me, he said, Red Garland's playing cocktail music in Texas. That's how he put it. He's playing, in lounges in Texas, and I'm sitting here playing Dixieland at the Riverboat, and I keep wondering, what did I do wrong? And and
Maybe it's as simple as like having a hit or something. I mean, look how I mean, I don't know if he was ever a big star, but think about someone like Ray Bryant. He had little forays into little crossover a little bit, but played with everybody, played every kind of jazz. It's on a million records, but survived. Did you know Ray Bryant?
Yeah, I did. In fact, I played with him a few times at this after hours place, Joyce's House of Unity on Amsterdam Avenue. And Junior Cook and I used to go up there. And
I mean, sweet guy, but I mean, I was just thinking like, Madison time, Little Susie, Cubano Chant, like had hits. I'm just wondering if Wynton would have had an opportunity to have some kind of breakout hit.
Might be the production. I think what label. I remember Ray Bryant doing some things on Prestige, which was like notorious for ripping people off.
He was on every label at one time. Columbia, Epic.
Well, I think he was with larger labels, because I think that Wynton, he didn't even really. There were a couple of records that he did for smaller labels, but once again, there's nobody doing the publicity for it, and there's nobody doing. Plus, Ray distinctly was like a pre-Ramsey Lewis. He kind of had his eye on the pulse,
right?
Of what people might want too. Right. In that way, it said, well, they like this funky kind of the in crowd type of thing. Let me ride on the coattails of that, because I think maybe I'd have to get it historically right. But if Ramsey Lewis had made that breakthrough, then Ray might have said, well, you know what? Damn, I can do that and not lose anything. Because everybody was afraid that they were gonna, if you went commercial, then you were gonna lose your real thing,
Yeah. Well, look how commercial Wess became, and was very successful, and still, maintained his artistic integrity. And Wynton was playing with Wess.
Well, yeah, and I mean, but it happens too, though. Sometimes, like say George Benson, for example, made a, there's a greatly talented guy. I mean, fantastically gifted, and he became very big commercially, and as well as he still played. It's not a question of like you forget how to play, but it's a question of aesthetically where your heart is in your way, and not that I'm not accusing anybody of putting their heart somewhere else, but I heard George Benson when I was 16 years old, 1968, I think it was. I sat in front of the Jazz Workshop in Boston and heard this group with Benson, Ronnie Cuber, and Jimmy Lovelace. And Lonnie Smith, I think, the organ player.
Yeah, that must have been rocking.
Yeah, it was tremendous. And there were 6 people in Paul's Mall, the Jazz Workshop. And they did a little local TV show that week, too. Had him on there, and here's a new young guitarist, George Benson. And it's almost what Sonny Rollins called the hungry fighter. He said, you can't ever really lose your hungry fighter. He says, there's got to be a part of you that's always a hungry fighter. And success at times can kind of dim that hungry fighter. Because as great as Wess continued to play, and I'm sure had somebody said, Wess, hey, here's a gig with Sonny Rollins, for example, and Philly Joe and this and that, he would have been right on it. I don't think he would have lagged behind at all. But the fact is, it didn't happen. That once you step into that commercial zone, that's where you're kind of, he didn't live long enough to maybe change and transition and get out of that. But, he had a naturally commercial style.
Who are you talking about now?
I'm talking about Wess.
Wess, yeah.
So we don't know what he would have done had he gone out of that. But sometimes when somebody did step in there, even Joe Farrell was because of CTI very concerned when I talked to him. He says, I want to be a star. He said, I want to make the real money. I don't want to be working these little jazz clubs anymore. He said, I can do it in the studio. He said, and I make money in the studios. But the thing is, it's not about that. It's about having a large audience, wanting that audience that Miles had with the transition, or that maybe Ramsey Lewis got, whatever thing. it wasn't really. Um, I mean, I don't know why Wynton wasn't more successful in that, because he had that element too. I mean, he wrote Scotch, Scotch and Water, that too, that Cannonball recorded. Ba-do-bee, ba-do-da, bo-be-do-be-da-da-da.
Oh,
The
right. That's
that was
Wynton.
yeah, and Zavigny gets credit, but it's actually Wynton wrote that tune, and he called it Joe's Avenue.
That's right. That's the title. I know.
Yeah, that's the way. But then it became Scotch and Water, and it became accredited to Zavigny, which is like unusual. But but I mean, that type of tune is so catchy and so funky. Had Wynton done a whole record of that, it would have, I mean, I'm sure been as big as anything that Ray would
I
have
think
done.
about what would Clifford Brown have been doing if he lived? What would Lee Morgan be doing now if he lived? Uh,
Well, Lee Morgan is an
I
example of that.
mean,
He had a big hit with the Sidewinder,
yeah,
but
but he was really forward thinking into the early 70s. I mean, it's just Clifford. If Booker Little survived, all these unbelievable talents who
yeah,
died
I mean,
so
it's also,
early.
yeah, I mean, Booker also was into, he had his foot in the avant-garde as well, with that stuff with Eric Dolphy and Mel Waldron and those kind of things, and funny, if you listen to the rest of the record, the Sidewinder, it's a bebop record, or whatever you want to call it. I
Oh,
don't like,
sure. Oh, of course.
but that's the only,
But
um,
I mean, imagine like, when you think of like trumpet players of the 60s, you think of, aside from Miles, of course, you think of Freddie Hubbard and Lee Morgan and and
Woody.
and yeah, and Blue Mitchell, and Donald Byrd. You know, if Clifford Brown was still on the scene, that would have changed the balance there.
It may have. I
Really.
think it could have, but it also, sometimes there are some people who find the way they play, and they may not want to play anything. In other words, I mean, some people have kind of restless, exploring spirits that want to change, that want to innovate, that want to do that. Somebody like Miles didn't want to stay in one place and wanted to do that. I think Booker Little had a little bit of that, at least in the sense that he was friends with Eric, and he was getting pulled along those lines. I mean, there was something that was happening in the music too, because when Ornette came in, then that was sort of like a certain way that you kind of opened up to that aspect of things, or you didn't. I mean, but even Clifford Jordan was, directed into playing freer at times, and
I love the way the players I mentioned, the way Freddie Hubbard played free, the way Wayne Shorter played free, the way Jackie McLean played free. I always thought if imagine if J Mac, maybe he should have been on Ascension. Imagine if he was on Ascension, what he could have done. I heard this recording. It was on YouTube and it disappeared. It was a live recording of Jackie McLean playing with Jaki Byard in Boston.
John Neves. I was at that concert.
It was like 76 or something,
Yes,
early
Alan
70s.
Alan Dawson.
It was a different drummer. At least credited.
Well,
Uh,
it was a benefit for They were playing opposite Donald Byrd and the Blackbirds, and they were opening because it was at the Berkeley Performance Center.
I thought this was maybe in a club, but uh, there was a Blue and Boogie, and they started out playing bebop, and in the middle of Jaki Byard's solo, he started to take it out and went outer and outer and out until he was by himself, completely Jackson Pollock on the piano,
Wow.
ballistic. And then Jackie McLean came back in and he was playing a solo cadenza, completely free, the greatest free playing, and he slowly brought it back in. And it was just just amazing. And it made me think maybe Jaki Byard was one of the, he might predate Cecil Taylor playing that kind of free playing, because he was older than Cecil. He was in Boston.
And
And
so
if
was
he,
Cecil.
and yeah, right. And if he
And
played like that, he might have been doing that before Cecil Taylor got there.
well, Jackie was one of my mentors. Jackie brought me when I was 17 to Boston to play at Harvard University, to play a concert with him, and then I stayed up for the next 2 years hanging out with him. And he hired me on some gigs, even as a teenager. And Jackie, um, he he would definitely might have been the first to do that. Also, he told me about, I mean, Richard Twardzik.
Right.
Dick Twardzik was also
Boston,
somebody,
right.
and he and Jackie were tight. And Jackie would, I think he was like one of the very first people to really play free. I think he might have been doing that because he said he'd been doing that a long time. I asked him about that, and you never know. He'd just go out. All of a sudden, you could tell the tube was going to go somewhere else, and there it was. And then you were out there, and you had to come in with that. And he'd constantly challenge you that way, and make you go outside the changes. But you were still playing, getting sentimental over you somehow, and you couldn't figure out how that didn't bleed.
This recording was just phenomenal. I mean, I just love Jackie could play out like, because it's grounded.
Yeah, well, he did do that. And anyway, the band I heard I thought it was Dawson, but I'm not completely sure. But there was one night that they did this benefit for it was for some black cause, and it was a concert. I believe it was at Berkeley before they had the big performance center, but it was like around there. And it was John Neves was on bass. I remember that.
Right.
And Jackie was on piano, and Jackie McLean did come up for that. And the drummer may have not been Dawson, but I remember a Lover Man that they played. That's still with me. That band was so beautiful that, in fact, a lot of the people that had come to hear Donald Byrd got up to play, and a lot of people left because I think the Jackie and Jackie set had just killed everybody. It was like, you didn't want to hear anything after that.
So you asked me, do I have any funny recollections? So we're talking about Jackie. So Jackie would call me and leave great messages on my answering machine. And one of the things, he had this like alter ego, this pseudonym. He would speak in this very faux British accent, and he'd refer to himself as Nigel Poot. Hello, this is Nigel Poot calling for Michael Weiss.
Yeah, there's Jackie.
But those guys, they had such great humor. Like I would ride in the car with Walter Davis, and he'd just turn to me and just start speaking in this gibberish language, like it just like as if he was speaking, German or French.
Yeah.
Yeah, and right, and he caught me off guard. I'm just like, I'm odd to be in the car with him already, so I'm not ready for that. And he'd laugh and laugh.
Oh, there was such laughter there. But Walter Davis,
yeah.
Is my favorite. All right, we're in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We're in York, Pennsylvania, playing a concert for the Society, Eastern Pennsylvania Friend of Jazz. Okay, it's a large auditorium, and Dizzy Reese was on the thing with us. Dizzy Reese, Walter Davis Jr.
Three horns.
No, just two horns. Dizzy and I, and then there was Walter Davis Jr., Richard Davis on bass.
Oh.
And Winard Harper, young Winard, was on drums. So we played a couple nights in Washington, had one step down, and then we went out to the Sunday to do this concert in Pennsylvania. Okay,
Harrisburg, probably.
Harrisburg, York, Harrisburg, and Steve Patton, who recently passed away, wonderful guy. And pardon my nose, and it's not what you think, folks. That so we're playing this concert, and Walter had one pet peeve. He had a few pet peeves, but one of them was he did not like arco bass. He liked Paul Chambers playing arco bass, but after PC,
That's
he didn't want
it.
to hear any more arco bass. He really didn't care for it. Okay, Dizzy Reese was having some problems. It was a big hall, and sometimes he couldn't hear us announcing the tunes, and thought he wasn't getting announced to because the microphone's here and he's behind me, and he's having a little hearing problem. So he was yelling at me. So during the whole Sunday concert, it's like, why did you tell me what tune you're playing, for crying out loud? Why did you? Finally, I had to ask the audience, could you please tell Mr. Reese what the name of our next selection is? And 700 people go, Evidence by Thelonious Monk. And then Walter stands up and says, you hear that, Dizzy? Like, you hear that? So we're doing this. So now, this time, we all have a selection. We're going to choose a request, right? So Richard Davis, he has his selection. He's got to play Blue Bossa. And Walter looks at him like, like, really? Because this is the man, Walter's the guy that transcribed the Kenny Dorham songbook. He knows everything that Katie wrote. And then it's sort of like, well, okay, if that's what you want. And then, of course, Richard, it's his feature. He takes the first solo.
Pulls out the bow.
Pulls out the bow. So now he's playing more and more into it. And now he's starting to take the music out with the bow. And now he kind of gets onto the overtones on the top of the strings. And he's playing these weird sounds. He's like out there. Walter now is up from the piano, and it's a large stage, and he's got his hands over his ears, and he's going buzz, 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 buzz. And so we take the tune out. So the next day, as we're waiting for our car to get ready, go take us back to New York, Richard turns to me and he says, rough day for Harry's yesterday, huh? I say, yeah. I said, you handled Walter Davis nicely. He was, you didn't get angry when he was going buzz, buzz, buzz on you. And, and he said, you handled Dizzy admirably too. And we said, that's nice. And then Richard said, you missed the best part. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, remember when I was playing my arco and I was way up on it and I was making those like overtone sounds and this and that, and you began your solo with your overtone sounds. So you started playing your double stops and you're like very free. You started out like really free and worked your way back inside. I said, yeah. He said, well, when you were in the middle of your going out, Walter leans over the piano and he says to me, now, see what you've done?
Oh, that's great.